Winter came early in 1894, not with snow but with a stillness that pressed against the walls of St. Aurelia home. The wind carried the smell of frozen mud and coal smoke, the kind that clung to skin and never washed out. The first wagon arrived before sunrise, its wheels muffled in frost, carrying a cluster of children who did not speak. They stepped down one by one, their eyes fixed on the ground, their clothes hanging in damp folds. Each clutched something in their hands, not blankets or bread, but sheets of paper, stained and fraying at the edges. The drawings were strange. Lines and curves laid out with an exactness no child's hand should manage. Rivers flowing in patterns no Missouri mapmaker had charted. Bridges suspended over waters no one in the county had ever named. At the center of each was a building rendered in obsessive detail. Chimneys, windows, streets, but always without a door. The head mistress, Sister Calliste, took the papers without looking closely, stacking them as though they were routine belongings. The priests who stood beside her said nothing. They had seen poor children come in before with scraps and scribbles, little more than the imagination of hunger. But these were not wild sketches. The marks were measured, steady, each angle so precise it seemed copied from a surveyor's book. Sister Calliste placed them in her office drawer and locked it, the way one might hide something indecent. She told the priests the maps were nonsense, the idle scratches of unsettled minds. She did not mention the feeling that crept up her spine when she first touched them, the way the paper felt slightly damp, though it had not rained in weeks. That night the smallest boy, no more than 6, lay in a bed near the dormitory stove. He had spoken no word since arrival, had not even lifted his head to see the other children. When the nun making rounds passed his cot, she noticed his body curled tight around something in his hands. His skin was cool, the kind of cool that does not return to warmth. He was gone, his face turned toward the wall as if to avoid the sight of the room. In his fingers was another map, this one unlike the rest. The church with no door stood in the middle, its walls marked with narrow black lines like tally marks. Around it the streets curved in impossible loops leading nowhere. Sister Calliste burned the child's blanket before morning prayers, saying it was for the sake of sanitation. The other children were told only that he had been called to a better place. But they did not cry. They sat through breakfast with their hands in their laps, eyes fixed on the table. The silence in the room felt learned, like something they had been trained to hold. By the second week, more wagons came. Each brought children with the same pinched faces and the same folded papers. When the nuns tried to take the maps immediately, some children resisted, clutching them with a strength that seemed impossible for their size. Bruises bloomed on small wrists before the drawings were pried free. Sister Calliste began to notice patterns. Each group carried maps showing different pieces of the same place. The rivers aligned, the streets connected, the bridges extended from one paper to another. She never admitted this aloud. Instead, she arranged the locked drawer so that each stack of maps was layered in the order of arrival, as if the sequence mattered. It was not long before another death came. This time, a girl barely older than 10. She was found kneeling in the corner of the dormitory, her face pressed into the wooden boards. Her lips were cracked, her knees raw as though she had been there for hours. In her lap was a paper she had drawn herself, though no one had given her ink. The lines were in her own blood, scratched from her palms with her nails. She had mapped a bridge suspended over black water, the posts carved with rows of identical faces. They were not crude drawings, they were portraits. Some matched the children sleeping in the beds nearby. Father Lucien Marquette visited the dormitory that day. His voice was gentle, his movements slow, the same way he addressed the congregation during feast days. He told the sisters it was nothing but the fever of neglected minds, the kind of hallucination that came from poor breeding and starvation. But when he passed the headmistress in the hall, he asked if she had noticed how the place in the drawing seemed fixed, as if every child, no matter their origin, remembered the same streets, the same buildings, the same landmarks. He said it as though this were not alarming, but rather a curiosity, a puzzle he intended to keep turning over in his mind. The nights at St. Aurelia grew longer. In the dormitories, the children did not speak of the maps, but some traced invisible shapes on their blankets before sleeping. In the chapel, Sister Caliste began locking the doors earlier than before, though she never explained why. The drawer in her office grew heavier, the weight of paper pressing against its hinges. It was as if the building itself could feel it. One night a storm struck the river outside town. The wind beat against the windows and the lamps burned low. In that darkness, a third child was lost. He was found at dawn in the courtyard well, though no one could explain how he reached it without waking the sisters on duty. In his shirt pocket was another map. This one was different. The church had a steeple now, and beneath it was drawn a square pit filled with shapes too precise to be anything but human bodies. By the time the first thaw came, St. Aurelia Home had taken in 23 children. 5 were dead. Every one of them had arrived with a piece of the same place no adult could name. And in the locked drawer, the lines on the maps were beginning to form a whole. Father Lucien Marquette walked the halls of St. Aurelia with the calm dignity of a man certain of his own virtue. His voice, when it came, was measured and low, like a prayer whispered into stone. To the town beyond the gates, he was a figure of benevolence, the priest who had turned his parish into a refuge for the unwanted. But within the orphanage walls, the shape of his kindness warped into something else. His vision of salvation was drawn from the relic pages of obscure penitential texts, the kind kept locked in cathedral basements, written by monks who believed suffering was not only redemptive but essential. He called it the doctrine of purification, a regimen he insisted would prepare the children for the map's final journey. The first rule was fasting. For days at a time, the children were fed nothing but thin broth in the mornings and a crust of bread at night. Marquette insisted it freed them from the weight of earthly appetites, though their ribs pressed harder against their skin with each passing week. The second rule was silence drills. At random hours, a bell would sound and the children had to stop where they stood, fold their hands, and hold absolute silence until the bell rang again. Some drills lasted minutes. Others stretched into the length of an entire night, broken only by the sound of knees buckling on the stone floors. Those who faltered were not beaten, not in the obvious way, but marked for the third rite, the one he called body stilling. Body stilling took place in a low-ceiling chamber off the chapel, lit only by a single oil lamp. Here the chosen children were seated on narrow wooden stools and bound at the wrists and ankles with leather straps that left no marks unless you knew where to look. Their chests were wrapped in broad bands of linen until their breathing grew shallow. Marquette would stand before them, hands folded, instructing them to slow the breath further, to find the point where the body no longer fought for air. He spoke of this as a holy threshold, a place where the soul could hear the coordinates of the true city. The first to die under this rite was a girl called Isabel. She had arrived months earlier with a map drawn in pale charcoal, its lines faint but steady, the compass rose in one corner smudged as if by her own tears. During a stilling, her head lolled forward after the second hour, her lips parted. Marquette did not stop immediately. He believed some children only reached their truest state when the body seemed to leave them. When he finally touched her cheek, the skin was already cooling. He dismissed the sister's alarm with the same calm voice, saying her weakness had spared her from years of sin. But the truth of her death was not weakness. When her body was prepared for burial, the nuns found 4 wounds, each perfectly round, cauterized into her skin. One on the center of her chest, one on the spine, and one at each temple. They were small, no larger than a coin, but each in the precise position of a compass point. No tool in the orphanage was meant to make such marks, yet they were burned clean, the edges sharp. The sisters whispered about branding irons, but none were missing from the kitchen. Marquette only smiled when the question was raised, the corners of his mouth tightening like a man pleased with an experiment's result. The other children noticed more than the adults realized. They saw how those chosen for stilling began to change in the days before. They walked slower, spoke less, their eyes drawn again and again to the places on their maps where the streets bent sharply or ended in dead space. Some began to draw over and over in the dust behind the dormitory, tracing those same compass points until the sisters wiped them away. The deaths, for there were more after Isabel, did not come in sudden bursts of violence, but in careful, measured increments. Each one seemed planned, as though the child had been brought to a precise location in their own body before being left there forever. Marquette's control deepened with every ritual. He knew hunger made the children's hands shake, but he also knew that hunger sharpened the mind toward obedience. Silence made them anxious, but anxiety made them attentive to his every movement. The stilling made them desperate for approval, desperate enough to ignore the pain in their ribs or the swelling in their wrists. And always, after a death, he spoke to the survivors in the chapel, telling them the departed had moved ahead on the journey, their souls already navigating the perfect city the maps were revealing. By spring, the doctrine of purification was no longer a set of isolated punishments. It was the air the children breathed. The orphans who had once resisted now submitted without a word, their fear turning into something colder, a kind of resignation that was harder to fight. And Marquette, the quiet figure in the dark cassock, stood at the center of it all, drawing no blood with his own hands, yet guiding every death as precisely as a cartographer marks a line. The maps in Sister Callista's locked drawer grew more complete, but so too did the unspoken knowledge among the children. Every coordinate was bought with a life, and Marquette was willing to pay the price again and again. The attic above Santa Aurelia had been empty for years before Father Marquette ordered it cleared. The sisters had once used it for storage, but the floorboards groaned under the weight of old trunks and mildew-heavy drapes. When the workmen finished, the space no longer resembled a room at all. Every wall, even the slanted ceiling, was covered in tall panels of polished glass, each joined so tightly that no seam could be seen. The effect was disorienting. Any step in any direction revealed not the space itself, but the endless multiplication of the person standing inside. Marquette called it the glass cage. He spoke of it as a place where sin could be made visible, where the soul could no longer hide behind the skin. He believed, or perhaps pretended, to believe that if a child stared long enough into their own face, the truth of their nature would surface. The rules for the cage were exact. A single candle was lit in the center of the floor, its flame reflected into dozens of points of light. A child was brought in after the evening prayers, locked inside barefoot, and told they could not leave until they recognized their fault. There were no chairs, no blankets, no distractions, only their face staring back at them from every angle. The glass was flawless enough that even the smallest scar or twitch seemed magnified, as though the reflections were eager to betray the hidden flaws Marquette insisted they all carried. The first to enter was a boy named Samuel. His crime was whispering to another child during the silence drill. He lasted one night and returned to the dormitory pale, with a strange stiffness in his movements. But the changes were not only in his body. He began avoiding his own reflection in the wash basin, turning his face when water caught the light. Within weeks, he stopped speaking entirely. Marquette considered it proof of the method's success. The deaths came later. They always did. The boy no one named anymore had been sent to the cage after being caught with a hidden scrap of paper. A partial map drawn in pencil, the river line so exact it seemed traced from something far older. The attic swallowed him at dusk. By morning, the candle had burned to a pool of wax on the glass floor, but the boy remained inside. His body was found pressed against the far wall, his cheek flattened against the surface, breathless and stiff. His fingernails were torn and bloodied, streaks of red dragged across his own reflection. The glass bore no scratches. It was as if his struggle had left marks only on himself. In his pocket, the map had survived, creased and damp from the sweat of his hand. This one was stranger than the rest. The river was there, winding through a black field, but above it floated two perfect moons, one smaller than the other. Their light drawn as jagged lines reaching into the water. The sisters were not permitted to ask questions. Marquette told them the boy had suffered a seizure, that the candlelight must have disoriented him. But his tone was calm, almost content. He said the cage revealed truths the human tongue could not speak. Privately, he noted that the boy's map had more precision than most. The edges of the riverbanks drawn with a confidence the others lacked. He began to wonder if the right kind of suffering brought the mind closer to the city in the maps. In the weeks after the boy's death, the glass cage became a silent threat that hung over every meal, every prayer. Children who were sent there returned with glassy eyes, their movements slower, their voices thinner. Some began to mimic the act of staring into reflections even when they were alone, as though afraid something might crawl out of their own face if they turned away. A few, scratched faint lines into their skin, trying to match the patterns they had seen repeated in the mirrored walls. Shapes that did not exist in the real world but lived in the distortions of the glass. Marquette refined his use of the cage. Those who broke silence or showed signs of withholding their maps were locked inside for longer. The candle was sometimes removed, forcing them to see only the dim outline of themselves multiplied in the dark. Other times he added more candles, the heat pooling until the air was thick, the flames fracturing into 1,000 shards of fire in the glass. The children began to understand that the cage was not punishment in the ordinary sense. It was a place where the mind could be dismantled and rebuilt in ways they could not resist. The deaths were never spoken of aloud, but they accumulated like stones in the foundation. Samuel disappeared after being sent in for the second time, and no one saw his body again. A girl named Colette was found collapsed by the candle, her eyes open but unfocused, pupils dilated so wide that no color remained. She died hours later, her skin cold despite the heat in the attic. Each death folded into the next, each leaving behind another fragment of the strange, impossible city on paper. Marquette kept these drawings in a separate bundle from the others, telling himself they were purer, more accurate, as though the cage had burned away the imperfections. By summer, the attic had taken on a presence of its own. The children swore they could feel its weight above their heads, the glass holding its silent light in the darkness. Marquette would walk the halls at night, his hands clasped behind his back, listening for the faint creak of the attic door. He believed he was close to something, a point on the map that would only reveal itself through one more death, one more night of glass and candlelight. And the children knew in the hollow way survivors know that when the attic door opened again, it would not be empty when it closed. The mapping sessions began without warning. A child would be taken from the dormitory in the early hours when the frost still clung to the glass, and led down the back stairwell to a room no one was meant to see. The oak chairs were bolted to the floor, their arms broad enough to hold the leather straps that would keep even the strongest from shifting. A wide table stood against the far wall, lined with shallow bowls of water, rags, needles, and a case of bottled ink in shades darker than midnight. Marquette oversaw every session, standing close enough to see the tremor in each child's breath, his own hands clasped loosely behind his back. He called it location work, a phrase he used as though it were an act of art rather than a kind of slow dismantling. The first touch of the needle was never random. The pricking began at the wrists or shoulders, the fine points pressing just enough to break the skin without tearing it. The lines were deliberate, drawn across arms, chests, or backs in the exact measurements Marquette dictated from memory. The blood was wiped before it could smear, replaced with ink that traced the wound again, darkening it into permanence. Every curve, every intersection had a place in his unseen city. The children did not know what they were drawing, they only knew that each mark was followed by another until the shape began to resemble something too precise to be accident. Those who cried out or shifted were not struck. Not here. Instead, they were taken to the basement, left in a low-ceilinged room with the air of damp earth and the faint sound of dripping water. In the corners, piles of crumpled, blood-stained rags lay stacked like discarded blueprints. Some were smeared into illegibility, but others bore the faint outlines of rivers, roads, and unmarked fields. The children were told to study them until they found the coordinates, a command that had no clear meaning but carried a weight they could not ignore. Hours in the dark stripped away their sense of time until every sound seemed distant, every heartbeat louder than their thoughts. The deaths in these sessions were not sudden. They came after long hours when the body could no longer separate pain from exhaustion. One boy's skin split deeper than intended along the shoulder blade. Infection followed, his fever climbing until he lay half-conscious, whispering numbers no one recognized. He died on the fourth night, his final map taken from the linen bandage wrapped around him. Another older child lasted longer, his body covered in intersecting lines that formed a pattern only Marquette seemed to understand. His end came quietly, his head resting against the strap that still held him in place, his skin cooling as the ink dried. The most haunting death was Thomas, a boy with a narrow face and the habit of tracing invisible lines on his palms when he thought no one was watching. His session began like the others, but Marquette's instructions that day were different. The lines pricked into his skin were sharper, the angles more severe, converging at a single point in the center of his chest. The ink turned blacker under the candlelight, absorbing rather than reflecting the glow. When the work was done, Thomas was given a sheet of parchment and told to finish it in his own hand. He worked without pause, drawing from memory the same shapes burned into him. When he was done, the map showed a gallows in the middle of a wheat field, its noose swaying though no wind touched the page. There was no wheat field like it anywhere in Missouri, yet Marquette studied it as though it were an answer to a question only he knew. Thomas did not return to the dormitory that night. The official reason was illness. The truth was that his body had been found hours later, slumped forward in the oak chair. Blood pooled beneath his bare feet. His chest wound had opened along the central point of the map, the ink and blood mixing until neither could be separated. The survivors began to change after these sessions. Some kept their arms crossed over their torsos as if to shield what had been drawn there. Others stared at their own skin with a kind of recognition, as though they could read in it the streets and landmarks the maps described. Even in silence, the memory of the needle remained, not as a sudden pain, but as the methodical rhythm of Marquette's voice, guiding each mark like a cartographer charting the borders of a hidden country. The maps from the dead were kept apart from the others, folded and placed into the iron chest in the headmistress's office. Marquette never explained why, but he handled them with a care that bordered on reverence. In his mind, these maps were more complete, more perfect, their lines drawn under the pressure of a body's final endurance. To him, each was proof that pain could strip away the false landscapes of the mind, leaving only the true city beneath. And with every death, that city grew clearer, waiting for the day when its shape would be whole enough to step inside. The first wagon came before the sun, its wheels muffled by a layer of frost that cracked softly under the weight. The children chosen that morning were not told where they were going. They were woken in silence, their shoes placed neatly beside their beds, and handed their folded maps without explanation. The sisters moved without expression, guiding them down the back stairs to the courtyard where two covered wagons waited. The canvas tops sagged slightly, darkened by damp, and from beneath them came the smell of wet limestone and coal soot, a heavy clinging scent that settled in the throat. Marquette stood at the rear of the first wagon, one gloved hand resting on the wooden frame, his posture calm, almost fatherly. He called each child by name as though reciting a prayer. They climbed inside without protest. The wagons rolled away in the dim blue light before dawn, the iron rims striking the frozen ground with a hollow rhythm that faded into the distance. No one spoke of where they went. By late afternoon, the wagons returned, the canvas still damp, the smell of stone and soot stronger now. The children stepped down slowly, their hands empty, their maps gone. Their faces were pale but dry, as if they had been emptied of even the tears to explain what had been done. They walked past the others without meeting their eyes and lay in their beds without a sound. It became a pattern. Once a month, always on the same day, the wagons arrived before sunrise. The chosen varied. Sometimes the quiet ones, sometimes those who had resisted in small ways, sometimes children who had given Marquette their most precise maps. They always came back lighter in ways that had nothing to do with weight. Yet some never returned at all. When that happened, the beds were remade within the hour. The blankets folded neatly with a single black line stitched into the fabric. At first, the stitches seemed meaningless, a straight length of thread black against the dull wool. But as the months passed, the children began to notice that each stitch was slightly different in length or angle, as though it were a fragment of a larger pattern no one dared to piece together. The absence of those who never came back was felt more sharply than any death inside the orphanage walls. There were no bodies, no graves to visit, only the empty bed and the knowledge that they had stepped into the wagon and vanished into whatever lay beyond the smell of stone and soot. Those who returned spoke little, but their silence was heavier than fear. At night, they lay awake staring at the ceiling, blinking slowly, their lips moving as if repeating something to themselves over and over. A few began to draw again, not on paper, but into the thin frost on the windows, tracing shapes that melted before morning. The sisters pretended not to see. One boy, Henri, came back from the pilgrimage with his hands bandaged to the wrist. Beneath the linen, the skin was raw, the flesh burned in straight, parallel lines like a set of coordinates. He would not say how it had happened, but Marquette kept him close in the days after, asking for small tasks in the chapel, always watching his hands. Within weeks, Henri was gone too, taken on another wagon ride, his bed soon marked with a fresh black stitch. In the courtyard, the ground beneath the wagon wheels grew darker with each month, the soil compacted into deep ruts. On certain mornings when the frost was thick enough, faint impressions could be seen in the hardened earth. Shapes that were not from wheels or shoes, lines that curved and joined in strange, deliberate ways. Some of the older children whispered that these were pieces of the city from their maps, stamped into the ground as if the wagons themselves were tracing the journey over and over. Marquette spoke of the pilgrimages as a blessing, telling the sisters that the children were being allowed to see something sacred. But his words carried no warmth. He never said what they saw, only that it was necessary for the map to be complete. He kept a ledger in his office, each page marked with the names of those taken and a small black ink line drawn beside it. The lines matched the stitches on the blankets exactly. As the year turned, the wagons became part of the orphanage's rhythm, their arrival anticipated like the toll of a bell no one wanted to hear. The children who remained began to measure time by them. How many rides they had survived, how many beds had been stripped and folded since the last. And always, in the space between their departures and returns, the air inside St. Aurelia seemed thinner, as if the walls themselves were waiting for the sound of wheels on frozen earth, for the moment when the door would open and another set of eyes would either return hollow or never return at all. Dr. Elias Crow arrived in early spring, his black coat trailing behind him like the shadow of someone not fully present. He came at Father Marquette's invitation, though the man's name already carried weight beyond the orphanage walls. Crow had served as a physician in the state asylum, where his methods were whispered about in terms too quiet to appear in reports. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who believed morality was a lesser concern than precision. His visits began with examinations, the children seated in a straight row, their jaws tilted upward under his gloved fingers, his eyes fixed not on their faces but on the small, quivering space in their throats. He told Marquette he had long suspected that speech corrupted memory, that a lie could be planted in the mind as easily as a seed in tilled soil. He called his answer to this problem laryngeal training. The sessions took place in the same chamber once used for body stilling. A brazier of coals glowed in the corner, the air heavy with the metallic tang of heated iron. Crow had brought his own tools, thin rods of polished steel, each ending in a flat disc no larger than a coin. The child was seated and their head strapped into place, chin lifted so the pale curve of the neck was fully exposed. The disc was placed against the skin over the larynx, and the rod's handle rested in Crow's hand as he turned toward the brazier. Within moments, the steel drank in the heat, and when it pressed into the throat again, the skin recoiled with a muffled hiss. The pressure was steady, not searing enough to char, but enough to swell and stiffen the cords inside, enough to leave the voice forever altered. Crow called it refinement. The first death came on the second day. A boy named Arlen, already small for his age, could not draw breath against the pain. His body shuddered once, twice, then sagged in the chair, the leather straps holding him upright as his eyes dulled. Crow did not flinch. He recorded something in his notebook before allowing the nuns to take the body away. Marquette insisted the boy's death was a sign that some were simply unfit to carry the coordinates without corruption. Survivors of the training emerged altered in ways that unsettled even the sisters. They could no longer form words, their attempts reduced to breathy rasp or silent mouthing. Yet their hands, once clumsy, became surer when given ink and paper. Their maps grew sharper, the angles more deliberate, the buildings drawn with architectural precision. It was as if removing their voices had cleared a path from memory to hand, unhindered by the detours of speech. Crow showed Marquette the drawings as proof, his eyes bright with something like triumph. One mute child, Elise, produced a map that disturbed even him. It showed a rectangular building made entirely of glass, each wall reflecting the others in an infinite chain. Marquette recognized it immediately as the attic chamber, the glass cage, though no child should have been able to see it from the outside, and certainly not from above. Elise had been taken there only once for less than an hour, yet her drawing showed every panel, every seam, as though she had walked around it 100 times in her mind. She could not explain how she knew. She simply held the map in her hands and stared at it until Marquette took it away. The deaths continued with a slow, methodical rhythm. Some children's throats swelled until they could not swallow, their bodies failing in the days after the session. Others lingered, alive but weakened, their breathing shallow, their eyes dulled to the presence of those around them. Crow adjusted his methods after each loss, not to prevent them but to control their timing, as though fine-tuning the exact point between survival and silence. To him, a perfect subject was one whose voice had been taken but whose hand could still hold the pen steady. For the children, the threat of laryngeal training became another shadow in the halls, as heavy as the wagons or the cage. They learned to speak less, to lower their voices, to hide their questions. The absence of sound changed the orphanage itself. Meals were eaten without chatter, prayers recited in thin whispers, footsteps soft on the boards. Silence became not just a rule but a condition, stitched into the air like the black lines on the folded blankets. Marquette saw in this a kind of purity. He walked the dormitories at night, hearing nothing but the creak of the floor and the slow breathing of the beds. The maps in the locked drawer multiplied, their details knitting together with each silent hand that produced them. To him, the science of silence was not cruelty. It was a necessary narrowing of the senses, stripping away what was useless to the greater design. And with each voice extinguished, the imagined city on those pages grew louder in his own mind, calling him toward it with a clarity no sound could match. The change to the refectory went unnoticed at first. The planks in one section of the long hall were stripped away and replaced with boards so thin they bowed under a fingertip. Marquette had chosen them himself, insisting they looked no different from the rest once sanded and stained. By day, the floor bore the weight of empty air. By night, it became the stage for what he called the trial of the floor. After the last meal, the chosen children were lined in 2 rows, their knees pressed to the narrow section of warped boards. The rules were simple. Remain still throughout night prayers, heads bowed, hands joined. Any shift of weight, any movement beyond a controlled breath would test the floor's strength. Beneath the planks, hidden from sight, lay a pit once used as a rain cistern. Now it was a trap. The water inside was glacial, drawn from the old underground channels that fed the well. Iron hooks were bolted into the stone walls, their surfaces slick with algae. There was no ladder, no rope. If a child fell, the only way out was to climb those hooks barefoot, pulling themselves upward in the freezing dark. Marquette claimed it was a test of focus, of purity, of readiness for the greater journey the maps demanded. But the children knew it was punishment masked as instruction, a slow torture that measured not only the body but the mind. The first fall came within minutes on the first night of the trial. A boy named Lyle shifted his weight to relieve the ache in his legs. The plank beneath him gave way with a sharp crack, dropping him into the black below. His cry was brief before the water swallowed it. The others were ordered to remain still. They listened to the splash, the scrape of skin against stone. the muffled gasps as Lyle fought to find a hold. By the time he was pulled out, his hands were torn, his feet bleeding from the hooks. He collapsed on the floor, shivering so violently his teeth clicked in his skull. When the sisters peeled his fingers open, they found a crumpled scrap. A map soaked through, the ink smeared but still legible enough to show a bell tower ringed with graves. The trial became a fixture in the orphanage's rhythm. Each night, different children were summoned to kneel on the boards. The longer they lasted, the more the pain in their knees spread up through their backs, making stillness harder to hold. Falls became more common in the final hours before dawn, when exhaustion dulled the body's control. Those who returned from the pit carried the cold inside them for days, their skin pale, their breath shallow. Some never recovered fully. A boy named Corin fell 3 times in 1 month. After the third, he could no longer walk without limping, his feet permanently scarred from the climb. Marquette marked him as unfit for further trials and moved him to the group sent on the monthly wagons. Corin's bed was soon folded with the black-stitched blanket. The trial's cruelty was not in its suddenness, but in its precision. Marquette did not fill the pit to the brim. The water was always just low enough to ensure the fall ended with an impact. The hooks were spaced so a small child could just reach them, forcing the climb to be slow and deliberate, each grip a choice between pain and drowning. He watched from the shadows of the refectory, measuring the resolve of each participant, noting who returned calmer, who shook with fear, who clutched at something unseen when they thought no one was looking. For the children, the boards became a symbol of inevitability. Even those not chosen walked past them with averted eyes, knowing their turn would come. The sound of a plank giving way became part of their dreams, jolting them awake in the cold hours before morning. And still the maps continued to appear. Some were drawn immediately after a fall, the paper damp from the child's hair, the ink bleeding into faint halos. Others came days later, unprompted, their details sharper than before, streets bending around a central tower, graves laid in precise rows. The scene always framed by a sky drawn darker than any the children had ever seen. In Marquette's view, the trial served its purpose perfectly. It broke the body just enough to sharpen the will. It silenced resistance not with threats, but with the weight of inevitability. And it gave him maps born from the edges of survival, each one closer to the city he sought. He knew the children feared the boards, but he also knew that fear had begun to bind them together in ways he could use. A shared dread could be turned into obedience, and obedience into design. When the planks were replaced after a year of use, the wood was taken to the furnace without ceremony. The new boards were even thinner, their grain twisted and ready to betray the first misstep. Marquette stood over their installation with the patience of a man laying the foundation for a structure only he could see. In his mind, the pit was not a punishment at all, but another point on the great map, one that could only be found by those willing to freeze, bleed, and climb their way to the surface in the dark. And he intended to keep sending them into it until the city's outline was complete. The feast day of St. Aurelia should have been a day of reprieve. For the town beyond the gates, it was celebrated with candles, bread, and hymns that softened the cold. But inside the orphanage, the day marked something else entirely. It was the day of unmarking, A ritual Father Marquette claimed was necessary to purge the children of the wrong coordinates their bodies had gathered through sin or defiance. The survivors of the trials, the cage, the pit, and the pilgrimages were led from their beds before dawn, the air sharp with winter, their breath clouding in front of them as they were taken to the long washroom beside the chapel. There the sisters waited with basins of water and stiff horsehair brushes, their handles darkened from years of use. Each child was stripped bare, their clothes folded neatly and placed out of reach. The first touch of the brush was always across the spine. A single, deliberate stroke that drew a gasp before the rhythm began. The bristles were coarse enough to tear skin with each pass, and they did not stop at the first trace of red. The water in the basins turned cloudy, then pink, then dark, the steam carrying the scent of iron into the rafters. Marquette watched from the far end of the room, his hands folded, his eyes never leaving the children's backs as the scrubbing moved from spine to shoulders, down to the ribs across the arms. He told them this was an erasure, a cleansing, a way to wipe away the false lines so the true map could take shape beneath the skin. Some fainted quickly, collapsing onto the wet floor, their knees sliding in the blood and water. Others fought to remain upright, biting their lips until they bled rather than cry out. But the brushes moved without pause, carving red patterns into pale flesh, sometimes reopening the marks from past torments. The compass burns, the inked cartographies, the laryngeal scars. It was not punishment for a single act. It was a total stripping, as though the body itself were being prepared for a new set of markings. Those who collapsed were dragged to the side, their heads tilted back, their faces sponged with cold water, before being pushed to their knees again. The deaths were not unexpected. One boy, no older than 9, was found motionless halfway through his unmarking, his head leaning against the basin's rim. His chest barely rose, the skin along his back stripped raw to the muscle. The sisters pulled him away, wrapping him in a sheet, his body twitching weakly before stilling. Marquette glanced only once before returning his gaze to the others as if the loss was not a failure but a completion of the ritual. Another, an older girl with eyes too large for her face, lasted until the final strokes before collapsing in a seizure that left her mouth foaming, her breath rattling against the tile. She died before evening, her body covered not in coordinates but in the weeping red of a map erased. The survivors left the washroom swaying, their skin glistening with a sheen of water and blood. They were given clean clothes, though the fabric clung to the wounds, and made to sit in the chapel for the remainder of the day. There they were told to pray for clarity, to let the erased lines give way to what Marquette called the true design. Many stared at the floor instead, their eyes unfocused, their bodies trembling from the cold and loss of blood. Yet even in that state, some reached for paper and ink, drawing with hands that shook, their maps more detailed than before. In the hollow of the chapel altar, hidden behind a panel that only Marquette and Sister Caliste knew could be removed, the newest maps were placed. They joined the others, a growing archive of pain-transcribed geography. When laid side by side, it became clear that each place of torment in the orphanage corresponded to a point on a larger, unseen landscape. The pit from the refectory boards appeared as a black square in the northwest quadrant. The attic cage was a glass-walled tower in the east. The washroom itself, with its rows of basins, was drawn as a long hall of shallow pools under a vaulted roof. The map was not of Missouri or of any place the sisters had seen, yet its lines were too deliberate to be imagined. By evening, the children who could walk returned to their beds in silence. Those too weak to move were carried. The washroom was scrubbed clean, though faint streaks of red clung to the grooves between the tiles. Marquette lingered there after the others had gone, his fingertips brushing the damp wood of the brush handles, his mind already on the next feast day. To him, the day of unmarking was not cruelty. It was a necessary calibration, a way to ensure that the coordinates etched into the flesh were never accidental, never corrupted by the wrong hands. Every mark erased brought him closer to the city that was taking shape in his mind, and every death only cleared the path further. For those who survived, the pain was not the end. It was merely another point on the map they were being forced to complete. The fire began in the early hours when the wind was low and the frost still clung to the eaves. It did not rage like the kind that consumes a building in minutes, but crept along the upper rafters of the west wing, licking through the beams until the weight above began to groan. The smell of smoke reached the dormitories before the flames did. Children were pulled from their beds and herded into the courtyard, their breath rising in white clouds as the glow behind the windows deepened. No one asked how it started. In St. Aurelia, questions were only asked when an answer had already been chosen. By morning, the west wing stood blackened and skeletal, the air heavy with the scent of wet ash and scorched lime wash. It was in the wreckage that the chest was found. A heavy iron thing with seams rusted shut, buried beneath the charred remains of a support beam. Two workmen pried it free, coughing from the dust, and it took both to drag it into the open. The lock was thick and unmarked, its surface blackened by heat but unbroken. When it was finally forced open, the inside was dry. The contents were stacked in careful layers, 43 maps, each folded with such precision that the creases lined up perfectly from one to the next. The paper smelled faintly of ink and something else, an odor sharper like old copper left in the rain. The first map was unrolled in the chapel, its edges weighted with hymnals. It showed Missouri as any surveyor might draw it, but overlaid with another place entirely. Streets ran in grids that ignored the state's rivers. Wells appeared in the middle of fields where no water table existed. At the center stood a gallows, drawn with such detail that the grain of the wood and the knot of the rope were clear. As more maps were examined, the truth became harder to dismiss. Everyone depicted the same town. The lines were identical, the landmarks always in the same places. The only differences were in the annotations. Small marks in the margins, dates in the corners, faint symbols pressed into the paper as if by the tip of a nail. The sisters recognized the marks even before they admitted it aloud. Each one corresponded to a child who had died inside St. Aurelia. The gallows had been drawn by the boy who drowned in the pit. The glass-walled structure was from the mute girl whose voice had been burned away. The bell tower surrounded by graves was the work of the child pulled half dead from the cistern. Every death site, every act of punishment had been translated into a landmark in this ghost town. The coordinates of suffering had been mapped with a precision that could only have come from a single guiding hand. Marquette stood over the maps like a man reading scripture. He called it God's cartography, declaring that the children had been shown a divine city, a place that existed beyond earthly measure. He spoke as though the deaths had been necessary, sacrifices that allowed the shape of the city to be revealed. His voice carried the calm certainty of a priest delivering absolution, but his eyes fixed on the lines with the hunger of a man nearing the end of a long pursuit. The state sent officials within the week. They questioned the sisters, examined the burnt wing, and photographed the maps. In their reports, they wrote of collective delusion and trauma-induced repetition. They called the drawings the product of mass hysteria, a byproduct of isolation and abuse. But none could explain why each map aligned perfectly with the others, or why the landmarks matched the exact places where the children had suffered and died. The officials left with copies, locking the originals back in the chest, which they ordered sealed again. For the children who remained, the discovery changed nothing and everything. Life inside St. Aurelia continued, the same rituals and punishments unbroken, but now they knew there was a place taking shape beyond their own survival. They could see it when they closed their eyes. Streets paved with the sound of their own footsteps, wells dug with their own hands, towers built from the memory of their own pain. And they knew Marquette saw it too, not as an echo or a warning, but as a destination. The chest was returned to the chapel and placed behind the altar, the iron still smelling faintly of smoke. Marquette prayed over it each night, whispering words too low to be heard, his hands resting on the lid as though feeling for vibrations. In his mind, the city was no longer just a collection of lines and symbols. It was a place waiting to be reached, and he believed the path there could only be completed by the same means it had begun, through the methodical shaping of the human body into coordinates. And if 43 deaths had drawn its foundations, then the rest of the city would demand the rest of the children. It was almost 70 years after the fire when the chest surfaced again, long after St. Aurelia had been abandoned and left to rot in the fields outside town. The West Wing had collapsed decades earlier, and the last of its bricks had been sold off to a quarry. What remained was nothing more than a foundation choked with weeds. When a construction crew broke ground for a new road, their shovels struck iron beneath the soil. The chest was pulled into the open like something dredged from a river, its lock still in place, its seams streaked with rust. The men who opened it found the same 43 maps, their creases brittle but their lines sharp, the ink unfaded as though time had no claim over them. The maps were sent to the state archives where modern cartographers compared them against historical records. It did not take long to find a match. The overlay was perfect, not to any modern town, but to a French colonial settlement that had vanished from the record after 1704. Officially, it had been abandoned following a plague that killed nearly every inhabitant. The survivors had burned what was left and fled upriver. No buildings remained, but the old French surveys described the same streets, wells, and gallows the children had drawn. Even the glass-walled tower, thought to be a myth in local folklore, matched the plans for a meeting hall that had never been finished. The ghost town had not been imagined. It had existed once, and in the maps of the dead, it had been rebuilt. Survivors of Saint Aurelia, now old and bent with age, came forward when the discovery reached the papers. They spoke of the punishments of the pit and the cage, of the wagons and the unmarking. They described Father Marquette's obsession with aligning pain to coordinates, how every death was noted as though it were a building laid in stone. One man recalled being forced to redraw the gallows from memory, his hands shaking so hard he tore the paper. A woman described the smell of the horsehair brushes on feast day, how the bristles left her skin raw for weeks. Each testimony was delivered under oath, but each was met with the same response. There was no physical evidence beyond the maps, no way to prove the connection between the marks on paper and the deaths of children long buried without records. No charges were brought. The state's report concluded that while serious abuses may have occurred, the events were too distant in time to be prosecuted. The official recommendation was to preserve the maps as historical artifacts and to create a public memorial in recognition of possible suffering. There would be no trials, no sentences, no exhumations. The chest was locked again and placed in a climate-controlled vault. Months later, the memorial opened. It stood in a new park on the edge of town, its design funded quietly by the state. To the casual visitor, it was a pleasant square bordered by young trees and lined with benches. Only from above could one see the truth. The park's layout matched exactly the main square of the ghost town. The gallows stood in the center, not as wood and rope, but as an empty space paved in pale stone. The wells were marked with circles of black granite. The surrounding paths followed the same streets the maps had drawn, and the benches were placed where buildings had once stood. There were no plaques naming the children, no mention of Saint Aurelia, no acknowledgement of Marquette's name. It was a memorial that erased itself even as it was built. For those who had survived, walking through the park was like stepping back into a place that had never truly existed, yet lived in their bones. They traced the lines with their feet, pausing at the spots where their friends had died, though no one else could see the markers. The air in the square was still, as if the map beneath it held its own weather. Some visitors spoke of feeling watched, though the park was often empty. In the final years of their lives, a few survivors tried again to speak to the press, but their voices were met with polite dismissal. The public preferred the memorial as it was, a quiet space for reflection, not a wound torn open. And so the park remained, its lines fixed in stone, the same as they had been on paper, the same as they had been in the French settlement, the same as they had been in Marquette's mind. Evil, after all, had worn the robes of charity here. It had spoken in the voice of guidance and scripture, had measured suffering with rulers, had charted agony into streets and walls. It had hidden in plain sight, not as chaos, but as design. And when the work was finished, it left behind a city no one could visit, yet one that had been built with human lives as its foundation. The closing thought is not a comfort, but a question. What do you think? Could this happen again?